The Syrian tank commander adjusted his headset and laughed. May 1982, southern Lebanon, and the Soviet advisor standing beside his T-72 was insisting, again, that they pull back from the ridgeline. The Israeli helicopters, the Russian kept saying, could kill them from distances their own guns couldn't even reach. Propaganda. The commander had driven tanks for 11 years. He understood geometry. A helicopter hovering at 3 kilometers could barely see over the hills. His 125 mm cannon could punch through armor at 2 kilometers. The math was simple. Get close, acquire target, fire. The Soviets had been feeding Syrian forces this paranoid fantasy for months. American precision weapons that defied physics, missiles that thought for themselves, sensors that saw through mountains. The advisor pulled out a folder. Reconnaissance photos from the Golan Heights, he said. Tank formations destroyed before they could return fire. The Syrian waved it away. Israeli jets, obviously. Or maybe long-range artillery. The Russians were obsessed with American technology, saw CIA conspiracies in every shadow. He wasn't alone in his confidence. 43 Syrian tanks sat hull down in defensive positions across the Bekaa Valley that morning, their crews relaxed. Soviet doctrine had trained them well. Use terrain, maintain spacing, advance in coordinated formations. Their T-72s were newer than most Israeli armor. They had the high ground. Syrian commanders had studied the maps for weeks. The valley's western approach funneled any ground assault into killing zones covered by overlapping fields of fire. Standard armored warfare. They'd fought the Israelis twice before, 1967, 1973, and while both wars had gone badly, the Syrians understood the lessons. Stay dispersed. Keep moving. Never cluster where enemy aircraft could catch you bunched together. The Soviet advisor tried one more time. He'd seen the American test footage from White Sands Missile Range, smuggled out through KGB channels in 1981. Helicopters engaging targets at 7-8 kilometers, distances where the target crew never even knew they were being hunted. Fire-and-forget missiles that tracked laser reflections, requiring no guidance after launch. The Syrian commander had heard enough. Soviet intelligence always exaggerated American capabilities. It kept the defense budget flowing to Moscow's factories. He understood the game. Besides, his regiment had anti-aircraft guns. ZSU-23-4s with radar-directed cannons that could shred helicopters at 4 kilometers. Let the Israelis try to get close. The morning air was still cool, temperature climbing toward the brutal midday heat that made mirage shimmer across the valley floor. Dust hung in the air from overnight repositioning. The Syrian commander could see Israeli positions 12 kilometers west, could track the occasional vehicle movement through his optics. Everything normal, everything predictable. His radio crackled with routine reports from other units. Resupply convoy arriving at 0900 hours. Reconnaissance patrol returning from the southern sector. The mundane communications of an army that owned the terrain and knew it. What he couldn't see, what none of them could see, were the 8 AH-64 Apache helicopters hovering behind the ridgeline 22 kilometers to the west. Their laser designators already painting targets, their crews cycling through firing solutions with the methodical calm of men who understood they were about to rewrite the mathematics of armored warfare. In 90 seconds, the Syrian commander's certainty about geometry, doctrine, and the fundamental rules of tank combat would be obliterated along with his T-72. The first Hellfire missile launched at 0847 hours, Israeli time. The Syrian tank commander never saw it, never heard the Apache's rotor wash, never detected the laser painting his turret from 8.2 kilometers away. The missile's rocket motor burned for exactly 6.8 seconds, accelerating the weapon to 1,150 kilometers per hour as it climbed to optimal trajectory height. Its seeker head locked onto reflected laser energy, bouncing off the T-72's engine deck. A bright spot of coherent light invisible to human eyes, but overwhelming to the missile's gallium arsenide detector. At 2.1 kilometers from impact, the Hellfire pitched downward into terminal dive, angling for the tank's weakest armor, the 12mm top plate above the crew compartment. The shaped-charge warhead detonated 400 millimeters above the Syrian tank at precisely 0847 Power 41. 16 pounds of octal explosive collapsed a copper cone into a jet of superplastic metal traveling 9,000 meters per second. The penetrator punched through the top armor, through the commander's station, through the ammunition carousel holding 22 rounds of 125 mm shells. Secondary explosion followed 0.3 seconds later. The turret, all 9 tons of it, lifted off the hull ring and tumbled end over end down the reverse slope. The Soviet advisor was thrown backwards by the blast wave. His ears rang. Black smoke boiled upward, the distinctive oily column of catastrophic tank kill. He scrambled for his radio, but 7 more explosions erupted across the ridgeline within the next 40 seconds. Then 8 more, tank after tank converting to orange fireballs and twisted metal, each kill identical. Top attack penetration, ammunition detonation, dead crew. No warning, no incoming artillery screams, no diving aircraft, just instant sequential annihilation. Syrian radio discipline collapsed immediately. Panicked voices overlapped. Unit 7 is destroyed. I can't see the shooter. Where are they firing from? Request immediate. Another explosion cut off the transmission. The Soviet advisor pressed binoculars to his face and scanned westward. Nothing. Empty sky. The Israeli positions he'd marked earlier showed no movement, no muzzle flashes, no visible threats. Yet tanks kept dying. 17 confirmed kills in 70 seconds. The geometry made no sense. Syrian doctrine said threats came from the west, from Israeli ground forces that had to cross the valley. But this was vertical murder, death falling from above, delivered by enemies who remained completely invisible. A Syrian lieutenant colonel grabbed the advisor's shoulder, shouting in Arabic, "What kind of weapon does this?" Artillery couldn't achieve this precision. Aircraft would be visible, would make noise. The Russian had no answer that made sense in the framework of conventional warfare they'd both studied. The Syrians were trained to fight tanks with tanks, to counter artillery with counter-battery fire, to shoot down aircraft with missiles. But how do you fight an enemy who kills from beyond visual range, from beyond your weapon's reach, from positions you can't even locate? At 0849.17, the last Hellfire of the first salvo impacted a Syrian command variant T-72. 24 tanks destroyed. 91 seconds elapsed from first launch to final kill. The Israeli Apaches never approached closer than 7.8 kilometers, never entered the engagement envelope of Syrian anti-aircraft systems, never exposed themselves to return fire because the Syrian crews never knew which direction to point their guns. The Soviet advisor stared at the burning wrecks and understood with absolute clarity that every armor doctrine Moscow had written, every tank formation tactic Soviet military academies taught, had just become obsolete. The Americans hadn't just built a better weapon. They'd changed the rules. The KGB intercept station at Damascus Central picked up the Soviet advisor's transmission at 0853 hours. His voice, normally controlled, professionally detached, carried an edge the signals officer had never heard before. Request immediate tactical analysis. American helicopter weapon system demonstrating capabilities beyond reported parameters. The advisor was reading grid coordinates, counting destroyed vehicles, estimating engagement ranges. The signals officer typed faster. Moscow Center would want this immediately. 8 kilometers. 24 confirmed kills, 0 friendly casualties, 0 visual contact with launch platform. Within 40 minutes, 3 separate Soviet advisory teams across Lebanon and Syria were filing identical reports. The pattern was unmistakable. Israeli helicopters were hovering behind terrain features, ridges, hills, building clusters, and killing Syrian armor from distances Soviet doctrine said were impossible for rotary wing aircraft. A captain attached to the 47th Armored Brigade described watching an entire tank platoon evaporate in 30 seconds. Missiles arrived from high angle, his report stated. Crew had no indication of threat, no countermeasure opportunity, no engagement window. The tactical problem was existential. Soviet armored doctrine since 1945 had assumed certain fundamentals. Tanks fought at visual range, terrain provided concealment, massed formations created mutual support. The American weapon, whatever it was, invalidated all three assumptions simultaneously. A tank behind a ridge wasn't concealed, it was trapped. Massed formations weren't mutually supporting, they were target-rich environments. Visual range didn't matter when the enemy fired from 8 kilometers away, using sensors that saw what human eyes couldn't. Colonel Yevgeny Urasov, senior Soviet armor advisor to Syrian forces, spent June 9th collecting data. By evening, he'd compiled reports from 17 different engagements. The American helicopters, identified now as AH-64 Apaches, were demonstrating 94% first-shot kill probability at ranges exceeding 7 kilometers. They fired, repositioned, fired again, always staying beyond the 4.5-kilometer effective range of ZSU-23-4 anti-aircraft systems. Syrian gunners reported tracking targets on radar, but by the time they achieved lock, the Apaches had ducked back behind terrain. The helicopters were using ground features the way submarines used ocean depth, appearing just long enough to shoot, then vanishing. Urasov's report to Moscow, declassified in 1997, noted the psychological impact. Syrian tank crews are refusing orders to advance into open terrain. Morale collapse is not due to casualties, but to helplessness. Crews describe sensation of being hunted by invisible predator. Traditional armored tactics provide no defensive response. He included radio transcripts, Syrian commanders begging for air support that never came because Israeli F-15s owned the airspace above 15,000 feet. Tank platoons breaking formation and scattering, which only made them easier targets for individual Hellfire missiles that tracked single vehicles with the same precision they tracked groups. The most disturbing intercept came from a Syrian mechanized division commander at 13:40 hours. His voice was flat, defeated. American weapon has removed our ability to mass forces. Dispersion makes us vulnerable to their ground attack. Concentration makes us vulnerable to their helicopters. Request new tactical doctrine. The radio operator waited for response from Syrian command. Silence. Nobody had an answer. Soviet armor theory had spent 40 years optimizing tank formations for breakthrough operations against NATO forces in Central Europe. That entire intellectual framework, wargamed thousands of times, refined through decades of analysis, assumed enemies fought at comparable ranges with comparable weapons. The Bekaa Valley was proving that assumption catastrophically wrong. Moscow Center flagged Urasov's report Priority 1. The Americans had fielded a weapons system that didn't just outperform Soviet equivalents, it operated in a completely different tactical paradigm. And the Soviets had no equivalent in development, no countermeasure in testing, no doctrine to address the threat. Bob Ferry sat in the basement of Hughes Aircraft's Culver City facility in November 1972, surrounded by failed prototypes and increasingly skeptical program managers. He was 34 years old, a mechanical engineer who'd spent 6 years designing guidance systems for air-to-air missiles. Now he was trying to solve a problem the U.S. Army insisted didn't exist: how to kill Soviet tanks from distances that kept American helicopters alive. The Tau missile, tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided, was the current standard. Ferry had watched film footage from the October Yom Kippur War showing why TOW wasn't enough. The footage came from Israeli helicopter gunships engaging Egyptian armor in the Sinai. TOW required the gunner to keep his crosshairs on target for the missile's entire 14-second flight time. 14 seconds of hovering in place while enemy anti-aircraft guns tracked your position and filled the sky with 23mm shells. The Israeli crews were good, some of the best helicopter pilots in the world. But 3 helicopters were shot down in 2 days because TOW forced them to remain exposed and predictable. Ferry ran the numbers. Average engagement range, 3.2 kilometers. Average time to kill, 16 seconds, including target acquisition. Probability of surviving return fire if the enemy had dedicated anti-aircraft assets, unacceptable. He needed fire-and-forget capability. Launch the missile, break contact immediately, let the weapon guide itself to target. But the technology didn't exist, not reliably, not at the ranges he needed. Radio guidance could be jammed. Infrared seekers got confused by decoy flares and couldn't distinguish cold tanks from hot rocks in desert environments. Radar homing was too heavy for helicopter deployment and broadcasted your position to every enemy radar receiver within 50 kilometers. Ferry kept coming back to laser designation. Point a laser at the target, let the missile home on reflected energy. Simple physics. Except the execution was brutally complex. The laser itself was the first problem. Ferry needed wavelengths that could punch through battlefield smoke, dust, and humidity without scattering. Visible light lasers, the cheap, available option, diffused too quickly. Infrared worked better, but still lost coherence over long distances. He found the answer in classified research from MIT Lincoln Laboratory. Carbon dioxide lasers operating at 10.6 micrometer wavelength. The CO2 beam could maintain focus out to 12 kilometers, even through moderate atmospheric interference. Hughes didn't have CO2 laser expertise in-house. Ferry spent 3 months commuting to MIT, sitting in on graduate seminars, copying equations from blackboards during lunch breaks. The seeker head was worse. He needed a detector sensitive enough to pick up reflected laser energy from 8 kilometers away, but robust enough to survive sitting on top of a rocket motor that produced 900 degrees Celsius exhaust heat. Existing photodetectors melted during test firings or got overwhelmed by background thermal noise. Ferry's team tried 17 different configurations: silicon, germanium, lead sulfide, indium antimonide. Nothing worked reliably until they borrowed technology from classified spy satellite programs. A gallium arsenide detector cooled by argon gas to minus 40 degrees Celsius. The cooling system added 2.3 kilograms to the missile weight. Army procurement officers balked. Ferry showed them the alternative. Keep using TOW and keep losing helicopters. By April 1973, he had a working prototype that could track a laser-painted target through 3 kilometers of simulated battlefield haze. The Army tested it at White Sands and promptly canceled funding. Too expensive. Too complex. Too many components that could fail in field conditions. Ferry's program manager told him to move on to other projects. Instead, Ferry wrote a 16-page technical memo explaining why the next Middle East war would prove TOW obsolete and fire and forget essential. He sent copies to every colonel and general whose address he could find. The rangefinder problem nearly killed the entire program in March 1974. Ferry's prototype could track a laser-designated target perfectly, once someone told the missile where to look. But helicopters hovering at 8 kilometers couldn't reliably determine exact target distance using optical sights alone. The human eye couldn't judge whether that small gray shape was a tank at 7.2 kilometers or a truck at 5.8 kilometers. A Hellfire missile arcing toward the wrong range calculation would fly over or under the target, its seeker head never acquiring the laser reflection. Ferry needed automatic ranging accurate to within 50 meters at maximum engagement distance. Existing helicopter rangefinders used laser pulses. Send out a beam, measure the return time, calculate distance. Simple in theory. Except the laser rangefinders available in 1974 were optimized for air-to-ground targeting at 3 kilometers or less. Stretching that to 8 kilometers meant dealing with atmospheric attenuation that degraded return signal strength by factors of 12 or more. Ferry's initial tests at China Lake Naval Weapons Center showed the commercial rangefinders losing lock beyond 5.5 kilometers, especially in dusty or humid conditions, exactly the environments where helicopters would be fighting Soviet armor. He needed more powerful lasers, but power created new problems. Military safety regulations prohibited laser systems above certain wattage thresholds because they could permanently blind friendly troops or civilians at extended ranges. Ferry found himself in bureaucratic warfare with 3 different Pentagon safety review boards, each demanding modifications that degraded system performance. One colonel suggested they just accept the 5.5-kilometer ranging limit and design tactics around it. Ferry pulled out engagement data from the Yom Kippur War again. Soviet ZSU-23-4 anti-aircraft guns had effective range of 4.5 kilometers against helicopters. Any American chopper that needed to close to 5.5 kilometers to get a range solution was entering the enemy's kill zone. Exactly the problem Hellfire was supposed to solve. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: submarine periscope technology. Ferry learned that General Dynamics was developing laser rangefinders for submarine periscopes that needed to calculate target distance in conditions where atmospheric clarity varied wildly: fog, rain, sea spray. Their solution used erbium-doped glass lasers operating at 1.54 micrometer wavelength, combined with avalanche photodiode receivers that could detect extraordinarily faint return signals. Ferry requested access to the submarine program specs. The Navy refused. Compartmentalized research, different service branch, no technology sharing. He went around them, contacting the GD engineer directly. They met at a coffee shop in San Diego in August 1974. The engineer brought photocopied schematics hidden in a briefcase. Adapting submarine technology to helicopter deployment took 11 months. Ferry's team had to redesign the laser cooling system because helicopters vibrated far more violently than submarine periscopes. They had to ruggedize the photodiode array to survive repeated launch shocks when missiles fired from the pylons 3 meters away. They had to shrink the power supply because submarines had unlimited electrical capacity, while helicopters counted every kilogram. The modified rangefinder weighed 8.7 kilograms and drew 60 watts, acceptable. Testing at Yuma Proving Ground in July 1975 showed reliable target acquisition out to 9.3 kilometers in clear conditions, 7.8 kilometers in moderate dust. Army procurement approved the rangefinder design, but cut the program budget by 40%. Not enough funding remained to manufacture the erbium-doped laser crystals at scale. Each crystal required 18 days of precision, growing in controlled atmosphere furnaces. Ferry found a commercial optic supplier in West Germany willing to produce them at cost if Hughes guaranteed future orders. He signed contracts his program manager hadn't authorized, betting his career that the Army would eventually buy the complete system. The Army canceled Hellfire in January 1976, reinstated it in March, then canceled it again in November. Ferry watched his team disintegrate. Engineers transferred to other programs. Machinists got reassigned to factory floor work. The test missiles, 17 functioning prototypes representing 4 years of development, sat in climate-controlled storage at Redstone Arsenal, while congressional budget committees argued over line items. The official reason was cost. Each Hellfire missile carried a projected unit price of $32,000 in 1976 dollars. TOW missiles cost $6,800 each. Army procurement officers did the arithmetic. For the price of one Hellfire, they could buy 4 TOWs and still have budget left over for training ammunition. Ferry understood the real issue. The Army didn't believe helicopters should operate as primary anti-tank platforms. Doctrine said helicopters were scouts and light infantry support. Fast, nimble, expendable. Tanks killed tanks. If Soviet armor threatened NATO forces in Germany, American M60 tanks would meet them in direct engagements at 2-kilometer ranges, where superior crew training would decide the outcome. Spending $32,000 per missile to let helicopters kill tanks from 8 kilometers seemed like doctrinal confusion wrapped in budget excess. He spent 1977 fighting bureaucratic battles in Pentagon meeting rooms. One particularly brutal session in April had him facing a procurement review board of 7 colonels and 2 generals, none of whom had engineering backgrounds. They wanted to know why Hellfire needed laser guidance when heat-seeking missiles worked fine for air-to-air combat. Ferry explained thermal signature discrimination, how desert sand reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit and created infrared clutter that confused heat seekers. They asked why the Army needed 8-kilometer range when TOW worked at 3. He showed them classified Soviet force composition reports. The next European war would see massed armor formations with integrated anti-aircraft coverage, extending 5 kilometers from ground elements. Helicopters using TOW would die before firing their first missile. The review board remained unconvinced. Ferry tried different arguments. He emphasized that fire-and-forget capability meant a single Apache could engage multiple targets in rapid sequence. Paint one tank, launch, paint the next, launch again, all while repositioning. TOW forced the helicopter to hover stationary for every single engagement. The colonels nodded politely and recommended the program be terminated for the 3rd time. Ferry walked out of the Pentagon that afternoon, convinced Hellfire was dead. What saved the program was Soviet technological advancement. In September 1977, NATO intelligence confirmed that the Soviets had deployed the ZSU-23-4M Shilka, an upgraded anti-aircraft system with improved radar and fire control that extended effective range to 5.2 kilometers. Suddenly, TOW's 3-kilometer engagement envelope put American helicopters inside Soviet air defense kill zones with no margin for error. The Army's armor-centric doctrine looked less certain when Soviet tanks came packaged with anti-aircraft systems that could swat American helicopters before they got close enough to shoot. Congress reinstated Hellfire funding in the 1978 defense budget with specific language. The program would proceed to full-scale testing, but unit costs could not exceed $28,000 per missile, or production contracts would be canceled permanently. Ferry had 6 months to reduce manufacturing costs by 12% while maintaining performance specifications. He renegotiated contracts with 17 different subcontractors, switched from titanium to aluminum airframe components, and simplified the fusing mechanism from a 4-stage system to 2 stages. The revised missiles passed qualification testing in January 1979. Unit cost, $2,400. Ferry had $600 margin and a production green light for an initial order of 840 missiles. Nobody in the Pentagon expected those missiles would prove their value in actual combat just 3 years later. The Israeli Defense Forces received their first shipment of AGM-114 Hellfire missiles in March 1982. 96 missiles diverted from U.S. Army inventory under emergency military assistance protocols. Israeli Apache crews had 3 months to learn the system before tensions in southern Lebanon escalated into full-scale conflict. They practiced at Nevatim Air Base firing range, painting old Centurion tanks with ground-based laser designators while pilots learned to hover behind ridgelines and loft missiles over terrain. The geometry felt wrong to pilots trained on TOW. You couldn't see the target when you fired. You trusted the designator operator, trusted the laser reflection, trusted that the missile seeker would find the invisible spot of coherent light bouncing off enemy armor 8 kilometers away. June 9, 1982. The Israeli Air Force had spent 8 days systematically destroying Syrian air defenses across the Bekaa Valley. SAM sites, radar installations, command bunkers. Syrian ground forces remained intact, including 43 T-72 tanks positioned in defensive formations along the eastern ridgeline. Israeli ground commanders wanted those tanks eliminated before committing mechanized infantry to valley crossing. Traditional options were problematic. Artillery would take hours to register fire and required hundreds of shells per kill. Fighter bombers could do it, but risked getting shot down by shoulder-fired missiles Syrian infantry carried. Apache helicopters with Hellfire missiles offered a third option nobody had tried in actual combat. 8 Apaches lifted off from forward staging areas at 0032 hours. They flew low, hugging terrain, staying below radar horizons. At 0043, they reached positions behind the Western Ridge Complex, 22 kilometers from Syrian tank concentrations, safely outside the range of any Syrian air defense system. Each Apache carried 8 Hellfires on stub-wing pylons. The plan was textbook. Ground-based forward observers would laser paint targets from concealed positions closer to Syrian lines, while Apache crews fired missiles they couldn't actually see hit. The first Hellfire launched at Arrowite-47. Pilot couldn't see the target T-72. Co-pilot Brett Gunner watched the missile arc upward into a ballistic trajectory, climb to 800 meters altitude, then pitch over into terminal dive. 15 seconds from launch to impact. The explosion appeared as a flash on the distant ridgeline, followed 3 seconds later by a secondary detonation that sent the T-72's turret tumbling. First combat kill for a weapons system Bob Ferry had started designing a decade earlier in a Hughes Aircraft basement. The crew didn't celebrate. They were already painting the second target. Syrian anti-aircraft crews detected the Apache rotor signatures on radar, but couldn't achieve firing solutions. The helicopters were too far away, too low, too concealed behind terrain features. ZSU-23-4 operators watched their screens showing Israeli choppers beyond engagement range, launching weapons that somehow reached Syrian positions 8 kilometers away. The geometry didn't make sense according to Soviet doctrine they'd trained on. Helicopters were supposed to pop up, hover, fire at close range where you could shoot back. These Israeli birds stayed hidden and killed from distances where return fire was physically impossible. By 0849, 24 Syrian tanks were burning. Some crews never reached their vehicles, killed while running for cover by missiles that arrived without warning. Others died inside their T-72s, never understanding what kind of weapon had penetrated their top armor. The Israeli Apaches expended 41 Hellfire missiles total. 17 missed, either because laser designation broke during flight or because Syrian tanks moved unexpectedly. But 24 kills in 90 seconds validated everything Ferry had argued for during those Pentagon budget hearings. The Bekaa Valley wasn't a test range. It was proof of concept written in destroyed armor and panicked radio transmissions that Soviet signals intelligence intercepted in real time. The classified report landed on Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov's desk at Soviet General Staff Headquarters 17 days after the Bekaa Valley engagement. Ogarkov was chief of the General Staff, the senior military officer in the Soviet Union, and he'd spent 30 years refining armored warfare doctrine that assumed Soviet tank forces would roll through the Fulda Gap and reach the Rhine River in 72 hours if war came with NATO. The report from Syrian operations fundamentally challenged that assumption. American helicopters equipped with precision-guided missiles had demonstrated the ability to destroy massed armor formations before Soviet tanks could close to effective firing range. Ogarkov ordered immediate tactical review. Within 6 weeks, the General Staff convened 3 separate study groups analyzing the Bekaa Valley engagements. The data was damning. Israeli Apaches had achieved 58% kill ratio, 24 tanks destroyed with 41 missiles fired, while remaining completely outside Syrian air defense engagement zones. More troubling was the psychological dimension. Syrian tank crews had broken discipline and scattered when the killing started, transforming from a coherent defensive formation into individual vehicles fleeing without coordination. Soviet doctrine depended on maintaining formation integrity under fire. If NATO helicopters could induce this kind of panic in Soviet tank regiments, the entire breakthrough operation concept became questionable. The General Staff's October 1982 internal memo, declassified after the Soviet Union collapsed, revealed the scope of doctrinal crisis. American precision-guided munitions demonstrate capability to engage massed armor beyond effective range of conventional ground-based air defense. Current tactics emphasizing concentration of forces create target-rich environment exploitable by standoff weapons. Recommend immediate review of armored operations doctrine with emphasis on dispersion and concealment. The memo avoided stating the obvious conclusion. 40 years of Soviet military theory had been optimized for the wrong kind of war. Marshal Olgakov understood the strategic implications. Soviet war planning assumed numerical superiority in tanks would overcome NATO's technological advantages. The math was simple. Send 15,000 tanks west, accept 30% losses to NATO defenses, still achieve breakthrough with 10,000 surviving vehicles. But if American helicopters could kill Soviet tanks at 8-kilometer ranges with 60% accuracy, the casualty projections changed catastrophically. NATO didn't need to meet Soviet tank armies in direct combat. They could stand off and destroy formations before the engagement even started. The Soviet response came in February 1983. Major revision of Ground Forces Field Manual FM 102. The doctrinal Bible for Soviet armor operations. Out went the emphasis on mass tank formations advancing in coordinated waves. In came new instructions for dispersed operations, increased spacing between vehicles, exploitation of terrain masking to limit exposure to aerial observation. Soviet tank commanders were instructed to avoid open terrain and concentrate movements during limited visibility conditions when laser designation systems lost effectiveness. The manual specifically cited American AGM-114 helicopter-launched precision munitions as primary threat requiring tactical adaptation. The changes cascaded through Soviet military structure. Tank production shifted toward lighter, more mobile designs that could exploit cover rather than heavier breakthrough tanks optimized for frontal assault. Anti-aircraft systems received priority funding. Soviet designers rushed to develop radar and infrared systems that could detect hovering helicopters at extended ranges. Training exercises at Totskoye Tank Range adopted new evaluation criteria emphasizing survivability against standoff weapons, rather than traditional measures of assault speed and firepower concentration. Western intelligence analysts noted the doctrinal shift by 1984. CIA reports identified decreased emphasis on massed armor operations in Soviet exercises and increased focus on dispersed maneuver warfare. The assessment was clear. The Bekaa Valley engagement had convinced Soviet military leadership that their existing armor doctrine was obsolete. One 90-second engagement in southern Lebanon had achieved what decades of NATO deterrence theory could not. Forced fundamental Soviet tactical revision without firing a shot in direct NATO-Soviet combat. Bob Ferry retired from Hughes Aircraft in 1993, 11 years after Israeli Apaches proved his basement prototype worked exactly as designed. By then, Hellfire had become the U.S. military's standard air-to-ground precision weapon. Production numbers told the story of complete doctrinal adoption. 28,000 missiles manufactured between 1982 and 1993, deployed on Apache helicopters, OH-58 Kiowa Scouts, and even adapted for use on Predator drones that wouldn't fly for another decade. The weapon Ferry had fought 3 congressional budget battles to preserve had transformed from experimental system to foundational technology. The vindication came in layers. Desert Storm in 1991 saw Apache battalions destroy 278 Iraqi tanks in the war's opening hours, using tactics identical to what Israeli crews pioneered in the Bekaa Valley 9 years earlier. Hover behind terrain, paint targets with lasers, fire Hellfires from ranges where Iraqi gunners never saw their attackers. U.S. Army after-action reports credited Hellfire with enabling rapid armor destruction that conventional direct fire engagements would have required days to accomplish. Iraqi tank crews abandoned vehicles and fled when they realized they were being killed by weapons they couldn't see or counter. Ferry watched the Gulf War coverage from his home in Torrance, California. News footage showed Apache gun camera video, the same top-down perspective he'd seen in test films from White Sands in 1979. Missiles arcing into terminal dive, detonating on target, secondary explosions from ammunition cook-off. The geometry he'd calculated on Hughes Aircraft graph paper in 1973 playing out across Iraqi desert in real time. Reporters called it revolutionary technology. Ferry knew it was just engineering, identifying a problem, developing a solution, fighting bureaucracy until the solution got built and deployed. The legacy extended beyond the weapon itself. Hellfire established fire and forget as the standard for all future precision munitions. Every anti-tank missile system developed after 1982 incorporated autonomous terminal guidance specifically because Hellfire proved that shooters who could fire and immediately reposition survived, while shooters who maintained target lock died. The British Brimstone, the European Pars 3, the Israeli Spike, all descendants of Ferry's insight that helicopter survivability required breaking the guidance link between launcher and target. Production continued long after Ferry's retirement. By 2010, the U.S. military had purchased 87,000 Hellfire missiles. By 2020, that number exceeded 150,000. The basic design remained essentially unchanged from Ferry's 1976 prototype: laser seeker head, semi-active homing, tandem warhead for defeating reactive armor. Incremental improvements added GPS guidance for targeting stationary objects and millimeter-wave radar for ships. But the core technology was 40 years old and still dominant. No replacement system entered development because nothing outperformed a weapon optimized for a mission requirement that hadn't changed: kill armored targets from maximum distance with minimum exposure time. Ferry received the Army's decoration for Distinguished Civilian Service in 1994, a ceremony at the Pentagon where a 3-star general thanked him for revolutionizing rotary wing combat operations and preserving American technological superiority in precision engagement systems. The general mentioned that Hellfire production costs had dropped to $71,000 per missile by 1994. Inflation adjusted, that was cheaper than Ferry's 1978 production models. Economies of scale, refined manufacturing, better component sourcing. The weapon Ferry had built for $27,400 to meet congressional cost restrictions had become affordable enough to fire at individual trucks and command posts, not just tanks. He died in 2008, 80 years old. By then, Hellfire missiles were being launched from Predator and Reaper drones in Afghanistan and Iraq, fighting wars he'd never imagined when he sat in that Culver City basement trying to solve the Tau missile's hovering problem. The weapon had outlived its designer and showed no signs of obsolescence.